Move on to our next speaker. We're into our panel discussion time, but this is so important and worthwhile. Dr. Mathew Hauer is our next speaker. He's an assistant professor of sociology and faculty affiliate in the Center of Demography and Population Health at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. His expertise lies at the intersection of demography, migration, population projections, and climate change. His research focused on how migration induced by sea level rise could reshape U.S. population distribution. More than 270 media outlets have hounded him and covered the research. So the coverage is good, but it comes at a price. He had a recent review article on sea level rise and human migration that describes one of the most costly and permanent consequences of climate change. So I'll leave it at that and let you go ahead, Matt, with your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Wish I could be there. Unfortunately, I had some changes go on in my personal life that were a little out of control, making it a little difficult to make a trip to California. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack. This is going to be a little bit more research heavy that goes into how it might relate to empathy. But I'm going to talk about some of my work around demographic change on the U.S. coastline, in particular about thinking through demography and how we should think about different populations and so on who might be affected by something like climate change. So I'm in a department of sociology. My PhD's in geography, and I'm trained as a formal demographer. So I wear all sorts of different types of hats when thinking about this kind of work. So sort of where I'm kind of coming from when I think about my work are two major trends. One is demographic, that the US and really the global populace is going to age and diversify this century. It's going to continue to get older and more diverse. And at the same time, climate impacts are going to worsen as the century progresses. And I think that thinking through either one of these trends individually doesn't really shed light on thinking about what these impacts mean for our country, for our people in our country, and for the world. So essentially thinking about this kind of thing at the same time as this kind of thing, right? That we have climate change occurring and we have a population that's diversifying and aging is the second part. That's part of the other demography. And I'm focusing on coastal areas for a couple of reasons. One, almost half of the US population lives in a coastal community, and coastal areas, both domestically and abroad, are some of the most rapidly growing areas. And so thinking through sea level rise and tropical cyclones and storms and sort of impacts, coastal areas are one of the communities that are at the forefront of these changes. And I think that if you think about what we should do about climate change and how we should best protect our populations that are most threatened and exposed, I think thinking about demographic changes can really help us make, hopefully, better, equitable decisions for protecting these populations. So it's not just thinking about the numbers of people, but also who these people actually are. Who are we talking about in many of these areas? If you look at the coastline today, most of the coastline is right around 50% white non-Hispanic. It's just barely below what we would describe in demography as a majority-minority community. But by the end of the century, the coastline, who resides in a coastal county in the United States, is going to be increasingly diverse. So when we think about who is impacted by climate effects, if we just think about populations today, we're going to miss the rapid diversification that is going to unfold in coastlines. So who's actually going to be impacted is going to be an increasingly non-white population. Populations that in the future were not contributing to this problem in any really meaningful way. If we look at the coastline as well, if we map it geographically, This is just showing the largest race group in each county, and the darker the color, the more concentration of that race group there is. And you can see that most of the coastline is dominated by that dark blue, which indicates 75+% of a county's population are white, non-Hispanic. But by 2100, that blue hue, that deep blue, is really blunted. And instead, who resides in coastal areas is a much more diverse area. And it's no longer sort of like white areas all over the coastline. We end up with a much stronger mix of race and ethnic groups. So again, thinking about who's impacted by sea level rise or climate impacts, we sort of have to think about who's going to be residing in those areas when those impacts are greatest. I did mention as well that aging and the coastlines are going to experience some very pronounced aging into the future. Here's just a real classic population pyramid. The hollow bars are the population in 2100, and then the stem and leaf, the red, is where we're at today, the sort of the population structure today. So today we have a relatively youthful population structure, but by 2100, and as the century kind of goes on to get there, the coastline continues to age. And by the end of the century, we're looking at about 3 times as many people over the age of 65 than we currently have. And you can look at the percentage of the population as well. Today, it's about 1 in every 6 people. By the end of the century, we're looking at more than 1 in every 3rd. And if you do a simple comparison, how do we put those numbers in perspective? Japan, we oftentimes think of as being a very old population. And today, Japan is about 1/4 of its population is over the age of 65. So if we sort of think about who's going to reside in these areas and the adaptation strategies that we employ to protect those individuals, the different mitigation effects and so on, we're talking about very different populations tomorrow than we have today. And for many of these areas, we'll see virtual stagnation in all the populations under what we consider today to be retirement age. So the blue is our working age population. I'm sorry, the green is our working age population. The blue is our young population. Those are people under the age of 20. And that red line that keeps growing, that's our population over the age of 65. So who's going to reside in coastlines in the future is going to be an increasingly older population with all of the sort of implications that come along with an aging population and an aging society. Even if we think about it in terms of median age, these are the most populous coastal counties in the United States, and all of them, for the most part, will see significant aging by the end of the century. The black dot is 2050, so we're looking at many areas getting much older, much quicker. To put these numbers in perspective, the median age in the US today is right around 33. So having median ages that are over 50 is virtually unheard of. And again, to put it in perspective with Japan, we're looking at a median age of about 48. So many of these areas will be older than Japan is today, what we consider to be an older country. Now, maybe you're asking yourselves, okay, the coastline is aging and it's diversifying, but is that the case everywhere? Isn't this just a secular demographic trend? And the answer is yes, it is. This is going to be occurring all over the United States. The more golden you see here, the more population we have over the age of 65 in each county to the end of the century. And when we compare it to today, the US is much more youthful than the end of the century. So in one sense, yes, these are just secular sort of demographic trends, but coastlines are a little bit unique as well. So while it is secular, it's not entirely secular. The blue lines here, the blue panel, those are going to be our coastal areas, and the yellow, the sort of sandy color, is our inland areas. And so today, our coastal areas are more diverse than our inland areas, and they stay diverse throughout the rest of the century. But in terms of median age, the difference between inland and coastal areas is currently not significant. They're virtually the same. but by the end of the century, coastal areas will be much older or significantly older than what we have in inland areas. So coastal areas are likely to be older and more racially diverse by 2100 compared to inland areas, and that coastal areas are aging more rapidly than inland areas. So why does this matter? Why sort of think about these towards the end of the century, and what does this mean for thinking about our communities and sort of being empathetic to diverse populations? Right, these are patterns, these are things that are happening today. These are photos that are contemporary. These are impacts in our coastal communities already with coastal flooding, tropical cyclones, storm surge, and so on. And when we think about these today, the populations that are affected are going to be markedly different. And these demographic shifts are extremely important for understanding things like the socioeconomic impacts of climate change. When we think about equity and environmental justice, who's impacted? It really matters for adaptation strategies and who gets protected and how they get protected. Perhaps building a second floor, adding a second story to your home to protect against rising water levels maybe isn't such a wise idea if the people who are going to be living in those areas are going to be older. It also impacts, what we consider to be migration as adaptation. Older people are much less likely to migrate. So if we need to employ migration as adaptation, how do we go about moving these people and providing the right resources to the right people to get them to safer areas? And it also matters for when we think about mitigation of carbon emissions and sort of building a more sustainable world, because emissions change over your life course, and older populations and more diverse populations use carbon differently. Yet, when you look at the broader literature on these sort of demographic patterns, I think these are still pretty rare. And I think that we could have a better handle on trying to tackle climate change in equitable manner if we think about these sort of a broader demographic shifts when we analyze and think about climate change and for climate impacts. I really hope that we can build a more just and equitable future, and it's hard to do so if we're missing a moving target, if you will. And then in the interest of time, I just want to say thanks and leave a little bit of time, hopefully, for any kind of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, this is a great reminder that in our work, if we're working with present data, think about projecting into the future and pushing ourselves into that uncomfortable place where it's uncertain, but it is important to go there. And your work is really would help to give some idea about population change and demographic change. So I highly recommend your literature. Everybody can go to it. We're going to transition now to our panel discussion, and I think we have two of the speakers, Chislin and Sam in the audience, and the rest of us will be online virtually. And thank you for the organizers for making this possible to have a hybrid panel. I know we're getting close to lunchtime too, so we may not get to all the questions, but I would love to hear from each of our panelists a little bit about what influenced your interest in ethics and mapping and your focus on empathy. We heard a little bit about your journeys in your presentations, but I'd love to ask the panel, everybody, the same question. So we'll just go in the order of the presentations, and if you could take a minute or so. Chislin?